Yeah, all right. And so here's the second part. I split this, and so here's the my sort of litany of what it is that makes up the establishment worldview. Uh, okay, just for clarification, and also to give you a break. Okay, basically. So in this particular story of America, there were a number of accepted truths, and this is so I'm going to go through them. So heterosexuality is the norm. Other sexualities and identities were either against the law. It was like sodomy was against the law. I think it still is, actually. I don't think sodomy's been taken off the books. Or is considered obscene or immoral or all of the above. Men were apparently smarter and tougher and stronger and just more driven than women, and men naturally were in charge of things. I mean, they deserved to be in charge of things because they were in charge of things. It was that it was that simple. You know, it was a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy in the same way that social Darwinism was. You know, that the white races in the 19th century came out ahead. Because they argued they deserved to be ahead. You know, Darwin put them in charge, basically. Women who didn't want to marry and have children, which was supposed to be their job, could enter the workforce in a few acceptable ways. There weren't many. The secretary was the most acceptable, clerk, typist, librarian, teacher, but not a principal, nurse, but not a doctor, salesgirl. Salesgirls, and when I was a kid, salesgirls might be 60 years old, but they were still called salesgirls. They're girls, you know, they're girls. So at the moment when I hear, say, a 22-year-old young woman say, well, I was with the girls, it's like, were you with the girls or were you with the young women? Because these are power terms, and how are you using them? You know, and I know, you know, it's all about empowerment. It's like, yeah, but remember that to be a boy, a 40-year-old boy, is to have power, and to be a 40-year-old girl is something else. You know, this is Lena Dunham notwithstanding. Okay, white men and women were apparently better than people of other races. The darker the race, the more inferior you were. And a lot of this stuff was true in Canada as well. I mean, the racism here was terrible in the 60s. God. African Americans were certainly supposed to be equal, but were not. And we'll take this up. Capitalism, democracy, and Christianity, Protestantism specifically, were supposed to be the best of each of one of their systems. So best of economics, best of government, best of religion. The best system was a democratic one. This is a democracy. America living in a democracy, running a democracy. Protestant Christianity as opposed to Catholic Christianity, which was still very much considered to be, you know, not really very safe at all. And that's why John Kennedy, it was a big deal when John Kennedy got elected in 1960 because he was a Catholic. And Protestants were like, oh, no, keep him out. You know, those crazy popist, you know, they're going to they're going to listen to Rome instead of listening to America. America pretty much single-handedly won World War II on behalf of the world, and now protected the planet from the threat of communism. There was, of course, a little bit of help from Britain, and, you know, the colonies, Canada, and Australia, you know, who cares? And then Europe, which, as far as America was concerned, they had to save Europe from extinction, basically, during World War II. It was America's job to spread democracy and free market capitalism across the planet. The elected leaders knew what they were doing, and they knew more than the average person, and they were to be trusted because they didn't lie. And America knew democracy was alive and was working for it. So this was consensus, and that was the agreement. And as the 1960s continued, because we could say at the beginning of the 1960s, this was the worldview. As we approached the end of the 1960s, this consensus had been challenged repeatedly. And it started, probably the most significant early challenge was JFK's assassination in 1963. But then issues of civil rights, which were really incredibly significant, women's rights, the Vietnam War, created these enormous ruptures in the fabric of the narrative of the white middle class. And basically things started to fall apart. And white men who had fought in World War II, who were now, say, in their 40s, were like, what is happening to the world? It is falling apart. And arguably, it is these men, their children, and their children's children who are the Trump Republicans. It's hard to even say they're Republicans, but these are basically the grandchildren of these men. That is the worldview that they are looking for. And that's what making America great again means. It means going back to this original deal. Well, it was never a deal, as I said, for anybody except, unless, of course, you were white, straight, and well-to-do. At the same time, a lot of the stories that were being told about these classes were being told by news organizations, especially the electronic media, which meant television. Radio had been around by now for decades. I mean, since the 20s, radio had been around and affordable. So it was not a new medium, but the television was new. And people looked at that and said, this is the end of this is it. This is the end of the world. Not only is this killing print and is killing reading and literacy, but it's going to kill everything else. It's going to kill film. And of course, it didn't do any of those things. It's always a both and situation when you get a new medium. Anyway, so the idea is that these media serve the public interest. That's the theory, and it's also that's what we were told. I mean, when I applied to a journalism program in, good Lord, it must have been the late 70s, they were still working on this model that journalism, served the public good. And they used to say, comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. Okay. But by the end of the 1960s, serious doubts about America's leadership and leaders had emerged. Rage at elected officials particularly peaked when Nixon finally resigned in 1974, having it had been discovered that he had not actually just planned, but actually had gone ahead and bugged the political offices of his opposition, the Democratic Party, in 1972. And before that. And so rather than face impeachment, and he would have been impeached, and then he would have been sanctioned and probably forced to resign. It's not really clear. He might have gone to prison. I mean, it really, I doubt it. I doubt that would have happened because everybody's nervous about the presidency, and the president's sort of like a monarch, even though Americans say they hate royalty and all that nonsense. But anyway, Nixon was out. And so this is the context in which Michael Herr rises, who had no journalistic training, and went to Vietnam with his loose contract for Esquire magazine. And he arrives in Vietnam in late 1967, and all hell is about to break loose because, remember, I talked about this last week, or the last time you looked at a lecture about the background, because he's about to see Tet, the Lunar New Year of 1968, unfold. So he's just in time to see this massive turning point in the war, and he will record it, right? And he spends over a year in Vietnam on and off. So he's actually, the thing about these journalists is they're actually able to get out and fly in and get out and fly in. And while they're in country, because this is, to be in country was to be in Vietnam. So people would say, are you in country? You're going in country, as I get. Which probably came from World War I, realistically, or in World War II, people talking about being in the line or at the front, but really it's in country. And Herr finally comes to see that conventional journalism, he says, could no more reveal this war than conventional firepower could win it. All it could do was take the most profound event of the American decade and turn it into a communications pudding, taking its most obvious, undeniable history and making it into a secret history. And the very best correspondents knew even more than that on 218, right? So again, if we look back, it's this idea that, conventional journalism is like, yeah, okay, forget that. You're not going to get the truth. That's the argument, is Walter Cronkite isn't going to bring you the truth on the CBS News because they're trying to cover it like gentlemen. Well, that's all over. This is not a gentleman's war. So he parallels, conventional journalism, conventional firepower. Well, if the war was unconventional, the reporting had to be unconventional too. And he says, this is great. He says, turns it into a communications pudding, taking its most obvious, undeniable history and making it into a secret history. So it's like it's a colonial war, but oh no, we're going to hide that. We're going to say, oh no, this is about protecting America from communism. Okay, so Herr also adopted what Hunter Thompson would frame as a sort of motto for new journalism, and I'm taking this from Fear and Loathing on the Campaign Trail, which, as I say, I think is probably the most interesting and useful of the Thompson, although I think a lot of Thompson's early essays, which were collected in The Great Shark Hunt, are also, the writing is better, is fine, it's very fine there. I think the later writing is just I think people wanted Thompson to perform this sort of as a crazy man, and I think he sort of played up to that. Anyway, but he says about his time reporting on McGovern running against Nixon in 1972, I went to Washington to write about the presidency the same way I'd write about anything else, as close to the bone as I could get, and to hell with the consequences. And this, as I say, is from Fear and Loathing on the Campaign Trail. So under Thompson, this came to be called gonzo journalism. And gonzo journalism comes, this whole idea comes from Hunter Thompson. So if you're familiar with this purple fellow, purple-green sort of boy, gonzo gets his name from Hunter Thompson. So here you see Hunter Thompson with his cigarette holder, and here he is before he loses his hair, and looking cool with his shades. And so gonzo equals new journalism. So because the idea, and Thompson sort of raised this notion that you had to be crazy to get this stuff, because it was crazy. So you had to be crazy. So you didn't try to get at what Herr earlier calls straight history on page 49. Herr commits himself to bearing witness then to the war, and he's warned that what he has to do, and he says this, he's been told by a Marine in Way who grabs him. There's this wonderful moment on page 207. He says, okay, man, you go on out here, you cocksucker, but I mean, you tell it, man. If you don't tell it, that's it. It's like you gotta bear witness, basically, to the insanity of this. And Herr does bear witness to the insanity of the fighting in Way, and Herr's ideas and what happens to the fighting in Way City gets picked up and used by Stanley Kubrick and put together with Gustav Hasford's own narrative from Way, which is in the Short Timers, and made into Full Metal Jacket. So if you don't tell it, then what's the point of having survived it or not survived it? More to the point, because people haven't survived it. And consider the story that he tells about a colleague who's just stupid enough to ask this. And you can just see this happening. So what would happen is the men would go out on patrol, and they might be out for 2 or 3 weeks in the field, and then they'd come back, and they drag their asses back into these bases, these fire bases. But the job was mostly to be out on the trail and looking for a fight. That was the search and destroy was the mission, after all. So they'd come back in when they, that was it. I mean, they'd done their 2 weeks in the woods or in the jungle. So they'd come, and so the correspondents would often stand at the gates, basically the fire bases. The guys would come in, and they'd be just dead, look awful and undernourished, because they wouldn't have been able to eat in the field because just the food is too horrible, and dirty and stinking, and shot up, and oh god, what a mess. And so one of the correspondents is standing there, like, how long have you been in country, he asked. The kid half lifted his head. That question could not be serious. And the weight was really on him, and the words came slowly. All fucking day, he said. And this is on page 179. Now, I didn't ask you to read this section, but it's like, oh, this is priceless. So how do you get the story out then? How do you get at, in this new age of television, where television has never been to war before, how do you get the story? Okay, and here I will stop.